Good evening. This is Ramon with Bold Like a Leopard. We're going to be talking today about a topic maybe not very prominent in the forefront of uh, American news and the discussion on the healthcare debate. But that's exactly the point, because in the coming months, I'm going to be doing a lot more on some of the more ignored aspects of why healthcare costs are so high. And what does it exactly mean, healthcare costs? It doesn't just mean services, it also means products, it also means insurance coverage. So I have here with me Dr. David Klein from George Mason University. You're one of the partners in FDA, what is FDAReview.org?
Yep.
And please tell me how you came to be involved in this field, and exactly what is it that FDAReview.org does?
Okay. My name is Daniel Klein, not David Klein, but
I'm
that's
sorry,
okay.
yeah. I think I
That's
know a
quite all
David
right.
Klein.
I have a cousin named David. Um, and I got involved in this because I've long been interested in how quality and safety issues are handled and how well market institutions, the free market, if you like, provides the assurance of quality and safety. And the FDA is one of the major pieces of government intervention in that area, justified by providing or assuring quality and safety. So it goes back a long way. FDAReview.org explains how the interventions work, how the FDA institutions work, and examines the pros and cons of of the interventions that we live with as compared to a freer market is the general comparison. And it's a very openly pro-liberalization website. We think that liberalization is in order, that a lot of the interventions were never justified in the first place and have turned out badly. Yeah.
So I have kind of just an experience from working in an industry that was affected by the FDA. We were a company, we designed medical devices. Not going to go into which ones they were, but the FDA was capable at any point of coming in and spot inspecting us. So just to start off, what products and what is the brief that the FDA has? Because it says the Food and Drug Administration. So what industries or sub-industries are really covered by its brief?
It covers food as well, and but its approach is different. The food control, generally new foods have to meet general guidelines, but they can move forward without being individually permitted. This is new products, and it's in pharmaceuticals and devices that there's this specific arrangement of banned until permitted, which is a quite different approach. The name that the FDA and officialdom uses for that arrangement is pre-market approval. But I think it's best understood as banned until permitted. Approval is something that moral authorities give. Saying that somebody approves of something sort of presupposes some kind of moral authority of that person. And the truth is that the FDA is no moral authority in deciding which drugs to take and so on. I mean, they're legal authority. They permit things. That's what they are. They're really permitters. And then doctors are people who approve, for the most part. So banned until permitted is the way it works. And that's a big difference from allowed until banned.
Right, you're saying that the real flaw here, and we're going to be talking about the downside effects of the approval process. Maybe get into the opposite approach too, because we have to keep a balance as well. But you're saying it's presupposing that there could be a flaw, meaning that you have to prove that your product will not be disqualified, as opposed to the agency
Yeah.
disqualifying it by the process, which is, do you think, given that a lot of these substances, I mean, we've had in the past, there are a lot of substances that were designed, usually especially pharmaceuticals, that ended up having or for example, we can go, and we're not going to go there, but we can go into some of these substances such as LSD that were synthesized for other reasons. Do you think that that does provide the justification for why there is this cautiousness towards approving things until they've been cleared of all these flaws?
I don't think at a legal level it is justified. That's not to say that there won't sometime, if you have allowed until banned, that is to say, people are allowed to go out and produce and sell stuff until the government finds specific cause to say, oh, there's a real problem with this thing, you're banned, right? That's very different than, oh, you can't go and do anything until you prove to us that it's okay. You know, if if the government knew everything in advance and was benevolent and efficient, then the two systems would work out the same. But the government doesn't know everything in advance. And so we need actually the experimentation in the market to actually learn what is worth having and what is not worth having. And that experimentation won't come forward if the costs are too high to develop and introduce a product. And the costs have become very, very high. So the chief downside of what we have, the official word is pre-market approval, is the suppression of drug development. We have fewer drugs than we would under the other arrangement. Fewer beneficial life-saving drugs exist now and are in the pipeline now because of this super costly, super uncertain, super delayed system that we have. You
Yeah,
don't go ahead.
that's kind of the experience I'm coming from. I was working on a system that, I mean, at least in our company's mind, and of course, sometimes we believe our own hype, but it was deemed to be kind of a step towards the next generation of that technology for the field that it was in. But we were delayed by FDA shutdowns for about 4 years from even introducing it into the verification stage. So is that a typical experience that you find? I don't know if you go out in the industry and ask people that
Well,
this. Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, the FDA is heavily involved in the drug development process because they have to approve of the whole steps of the development and of the testing. So they're very much involved and setting the ropes even before the drug application is filed. And so, yeah, a lot of this is all part of the extreme costs and why it's been estimated as well over $1 billion per drug approved in the pharmaceutical industry, just to deal with getting approval for the drugs that they do get approval for. It works out to well over $1 billion a drug. So, and plus it's this very long delay, and plus it's uncertainty. Don't forget uncertainty. How much are you going to pour into this idea if you don't even know that you're going to be allowed to bring it forward, even if it's good? So all of this just suppresses research and development, and that's the real tragedy in it. You can point to drugs that have come out in other countries before they've been permitted in the United States and talk about that kind of drug lag and that kind of thing. But the real tragedy is the suppression of drugs that we just don't see, really. It just totally stands to reason that without incentive, there's less drug development, less investment, less research, and everything else.
So there's a lot of questions that I don't know if we're going to get to, but I'll try to work through them, kind of make sense out of them. But we've already talked about the downside effects of pre-market approval, which, you know, in that small phrase, it's a very long process, and I know exactly what you're talking about.
Pre-market.
Pre-market, yeah, pre-market approval. In my experience, I'll just give one example before I get to the next question. I remember working with software engineers that had to get their editor for their code approved. Not the code itself, but the editor for a part of the software and it would have to go through approvals and revisions, and it was and I'm basically I'm really summarizing it a lot. It was, to put it lightly, if you know a coder, it is a living hell to go through that type of stuff, because those people they're typically used to the freedom of the software world where you're able to be creative and everything. So I think that there's plenty, and you're talking about the drug industry, but there's plenty of areas where this just keeps innovation down. Now, where do you see the FDA, the USDA? I don't know. I don't think you deal with the USDA, but related safety bodies in the U.S. as having a necessary role in ensuring that products used in the medical and food industries are safe and appropriately marketed?
By and large, a necessary role, not. And if there is going to be federal regulation for safety of such things, again, I think it should take the resilience type of approach. That's something that Aaron Wildavsky described resilience as compared to anticipation. Anticipation is like the software example you were just giving. Oh, you got to show me that the code editor's right before you can do it. That's the anticipation. That's the pre-market approval type approach. Instead, resilience says you're allowed to act, but once a problem occurs, we resiliently maybe recall what you're doing or ban what you're doing or file a lawsuit against what you're doing. And so if there's going to be some federal government safety controls, I think they should have this resilience kind of approach where they let people act, they let markets function, they let people innovate, they let people develop things, and then they act when they see that a problem is involved in what they're doing. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And that's completely the opposite of the pre-market approval.
So what do you think is the motivation? We were discussing back and forth earlier, but with their stingy permission, why do you think that they go for this it's almost an inquisition at some points, and that's what I would use. It's not your opinion, or maybe it is, but I didn't ask you. It's why do you think that they are so draconian in that approach towards giving permission and approving all these stages?
That's a good question. So they are permitters, the FDA. That's something to keep in mind. The banner is, as it were, Congress. Congress in the legislation imposed the blanket ban and then charged the FDA to hear these applications for individual permissions. So the FDA is, in that sense, in the business of giving permission. And then the question is, couldn't they be more generous with the permission and give it more readily? And I think they certainly could. So why don't they give it more readily? Why are they stingy? Well, I think one sure reason is that there's a great asymmetry in the consequences for them of between allowing a drug that turns out to be bad and not allowing a drug that would be good. See, those are two different kinds of wrong outcomes, kind of like a false positive and a false negative. And there's a huge asymmetry for them in that if they allow a drug that turns out to be bad, then it first of all it gets out, so people see it and they see the badness, and there's deaths, there's morbidity, there's problems, there's complaints, there's lawsuits, there's TV cameras, there's Oprah, and so they can drag the FDA reviewers, who were the ones who actually approved the thing, in and point fingers and everything else, and it's a disaster. But what happens when they withhold permission for a drug? Well, it never gets out, and they never see, no one can really see the good the drug would have done had people been able to take it, right? I mean, it's not out, so people really don't see what it can do. And if anyone asks about it because they know a little bit about clinical trials and so on, where some people have had, maybe a few people have had good results, the FDA just says, oh, it's too uncertain and it's unsafe, and it just doesn't have the same kind of impact. I mean, maybe in some cases, and of course in the AIDS case in those days, there was maybe a special case that took years and years to build, and that did have some pressure. But by and large, there's this huge asymmetry, I think. And so they have this personal incentive to bias, to err on the side of stinginess. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think the result that ends up being, which was kind of something, it's a question we're not going to get to, but in the interest of time, I think we're talking about the wasted potential of drugs that never get developed to begin with, and the wasted effort of drugs that are developed but never get approved. Is that
Yeah.
a correct way of describing it?
Yes, yes. Yeah, I suppose some drugs get developed and never get approved. I'm not sure how well they know how effective the drug can be, but yeah, I suppose that could happen too. But I think more it's just that the drugs aren't really brought forward to be ready for application. Yeah, that's the big tragedy. That really is the big tragedy.
So I was taking a glance. I didn't get to read, and I'm going to be kind of in some of the projects I'm going to be doing going forward. I'm going to be, of course, checking back with your organization as a resource for knowledge. And I noticed that you did have a history of the FDA, which would be too long to go into now. But as it's operating today, does it fulfill its original purpose, or do you think it's had like this departure, become really, just perverted the original purpose of its existence?
There is no single original purpose. It grew in stages, and it became the legislation itself gave it more and more power and monolithic certifier status. So it kind of turned it. The legislation itself turned it into a monopoly certifier or permitter. So I do think that the FDA has itself, its staff, has tended to push for even more control, extending its powers and so forth. But it's not as though it's highly out of tune with the legislation that created it. I mean, the legislation banned, like I say, banned drugs, put them in charge of permitting. So the basic ban was the Congress is doing. You can't really pin that on the FDA. I do
But
think,
it's
though, there's
similar.
wiggle room. There's wiggle room. There's a lot of wiggle room, I think. So, I mean, the FDA could, again, be more generous with permission.
Yeah, I think it's similar to the role, and it's kind of a rough parallel. I'm not comparing them in every way, but the FBI originally did not have the same amount of jurisdiction as it did today. It grew because of a lot of lobbying on the part of people within it in the halls of power.
Mm.
And the EPA, which is a little closer to, it's a regulatory body, originally wasn't as powerful as it is today. So we're kind of getting a picture of just this mission creep of these agencies, which it is perfectly legal, everything that they're doing. It's just, like you said, there's a huge cost that gets disappeared from public view by all of the diligent work that they're doing, which unfortunately could be preventing a lot of these treatments and pharmaceuticals from reaching the market. Um, I have this. This is probably going to be a popular question, but do you believe that it is a result of the regulatory power and overreach of these agencies, as well as the DEA and other law enforcement, that recreational substances are still as rigorously policed as they are? So we're talking about, does the FDA have a role in keeping some of these recreational substances uh, illegal, such as obviously cannabis, and we could talk about some of the harder drugs, but what's
I'm
your
not really sure, but I don't think that they are big proponents or a big force behind drug prohibition. It's I don't s- I, s- I see the support for drug prohibition is more widespread and in the DEA and other things like that. In some of the party politics, just in a lot of opinion in the public. So I know I don't think the FDA plays a significant role in the criminalization of recreational drugs, but I'm really not sure.
So yeah, I think it's kind of a topic of conversation among people that are trying to decriminalize them. That the pharmaceutical industry is for sure, in their mind, trying to keep the prohibition alive. But I was just wondering if it had to do also with agencies. But I guess that is more of a DEA issue. After all, the DEA also has a large degree of influence on the drug
I mean, what's the
development industry.
story? The story is that if pot were legal, the pharmaceuticals would sell less
Painkillers usually.
painkillers and such.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I suppose there might be some truth to that. I really don't know.
So we have this is a question. I was looking at a lot of these stories the past couple years with Martin Shkreli, and there was the daughter of Senator Manchin who she worked for Mylan. So before we talk about that, do these pharmaceutical companies, these giants like GlaxoSmithKline and Merck and Eli Lilly, do they favor liberalization, or are they in favor of keeping the regulatory burden as it is?
They're certainly not open or outspoken about those issues, and so it's not easy to guess how they feel about liberalization. I think there's points on both sides. You can imagine reasons why they would be in favor of liberalization, and you can imagine reasons why they wouldn't be. And so you have to speculate, and probably for different companies in different situations, these points, the balance of them is different. But points in favor of liberalization is, well, gee, if they are in the drug development business and selling drugs business. And so if they can do that at lower cost and with greater certainty and less delay, their costs of bringing new drugs forward would be lower. And they'd be able to develop products for the market more easily and presumably gain in that respect. The thing is, though, on the other side, that the controls are extremely heavy and burdensome and difficult to learn and know and comply with. And they are all invested in that and experts in that. Their regulatory affairs departments are built up. They have the rapport with the FDA. I mean, if we're talking about the biggest drug companies, right? Big pharma, so to speak. So they're already there. And other companies, smaller companies, can't afford to build up that kind of expertise. It's a usual kind of regulatory compliance story. I mean, small businesses don't aren't big enough to sort of pay for the fixed costs of getting the kind of regulatory compliance expertise. And it's not just compliance; it's lobbying and schmoozing and negotiating and everything else. And so they are now, in a way, brokers. The big pharma, in a way, are gates, if you like, for products to sort of come to them, developed elsewhere. They buy them and then they shepherd them. You see what I'm saying?
I see exactly what you're saying, because that's the experience. Again, like the experience I had, not in pharma. Again, I was in device design, but what would happen is, even if our company did not have the staff available, all we had to do, there are actually, beyond that, there are companies that contract specialists in compliance, uh,
Right.
compliance paperwork and all that. And I remember one month we just swelled up. The parking lot went from being, it was almost like the tide came in, and there was just this flood of these people from all, Puerto Rico and Texas and New Jersey that came in. And we had all these people come in, and maybe 2 months later, of course, the contract expires and it's over, because we were done with that compliance issue. For exactly the reasons you're talking about, a large multinational corporation, they can absorb those costs, and they definitely have accounting contingencies, let's call them, that they can use in order to
Yeah.
defray those costs, and it's not really a problem. So therefore, I think, and I I bet that you're kind of getting at it, that this is a comfortable environment for them to function in, where they don't have to worry about new competition.
That's right. I think if it were greatly liberalized, the competition would be much more fierce and open, contestable. Um, so in that respect, in the longer run, it's very possible that the big companies would lose by liberalization.
Okay, so this one question I do want to leave for the end, but there was Martin Shkreli again, who he was such a photogenic villain for the media when they said that he was price gouging Daraprim, which is I believe it was an AIDS it was an AIDS
Yeah, that's what I
I
understand.
think it was an AIDS drug for only a few. It was only a select thousands, that several thousand people were prescribed with it. Um, do you see him as having perpetrated a crime in hiking the price of Daraprim in 2016? And do you see the same issue cropping up with the EpiPen last year, where the price shot up within I think it was 600% or something? Uh,
I looked
what's
up
your view of that?
I looked up again the Daraprim just because you prompt me on this in advance. And my understanding is that the guy is that the drug was off patent, but so the company that had the patent was making the drug. And even though the patent had expired, there had not yet been anyone who put through a generic application such that others could now produce the drug off label or generically. And to do that, it now costs up to $20 million to get that generic green light. Okay. And so this guy, I gather, this villainous guy, and my reading is just pretty superficial on this. Um, Sort of saw the scheme and this angle, saw that these people were dependent on it in the short term, saw that it would take time and trouble for anyone else to jump into the market to provide the drug, which even though it was now off patent. And so he bought up the company and the patent. Then he jacked up the price, and because it was a big regulatory barrier for others to start producing it as a generic, he got away with charging this high price. My understanding, I mean, I don't know what has come in the wake of the last couple of months, but is that he hadn't broken the law. I do think it sounds very unethical, especially how much he raised the price. I mean, I do think it's maybe a case of legal profit that's not good for society at large. But in some sense, the whole problem does stem from these regulatory barriers for competition, even once the patent is gone, right?
Yeah, I think that if the regulatory burden and the pipeline to get these, and in this case the generic that you're talking about, if it was not so long, then he wouldn't have had the pretext to jack the prices up, because he could just cite the issue where, well, I have to deal right now with all the costs of developing and getting the compliance for that process. What do you expect me to do? Lose tons of money off of this drug, which is apparently the price had been way too low up until that point, and it was not a widely used medication. So what the press did was they painted him as this guy who was exploiting AIDS patients, which is
Yeah.
it's
Well,
not
look,
as it's not as if that's incorrect, but they have to
but
remember how the
look,
problem started. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I don't know more, so I'm speculating, and perhaps you're speculating as well. But so the drug had been selling for about what, $14 a pop, and then he raised it to $750 a pill.
Yep.
Now, this is kind of something I can imagine. The company that had the patent and had been producing the drug or had been arranging the production of the drug, they actually have a brand name. They actually have a reputation. They actually don't want to be known as charging an exorbitant amount for a drug because they have trading part. So this guy, if I don't know if this is the right story, but it's kind of my impression, like buys the drug, gets the right to the drug from that owner, and he doesn't have that same reputational stake in being decent. You know what I mean? And all of a sudden, he just sees a quick killing on this one maneuver where these people are dependent on this drug, and he's going to jack up the price exorbitantly. Very irregular kind of activity that's really regulatory, a result of regulatory restraints, or so that's something like that. It's a very irregular thing. I mean,
And
yeah.
that's exactly, he was called before Congress, and that's roughly, I mean, and his obviously his style was very different from yours, but he explained it in just that way. Uh, Although everybody knows that his motivation, obviously, this is a he was called the Pharma Bro, and his motive is profit. But he explained it the same way, and like both you and me, and he stated the regulatory burden allowed this problem to present itself.
That
And
doesn't mean it
that's,
was ethical for him to take advantage of it.
yeah, that's correct. That's kind, it's kind of the way the black market works for other commodities, in my opinion, that you just see this inflation of the price due to
Yeah.
a lot of price controls in the regular market.
Uh,
We're
I think there's more ethics. I mean, in the black market, if they're dealing honestly, and if they're not selling a product that's so terrible for people who are buying it, because I mean, he's cutting back on the quantity transacted by jacking up the price, whereas black market suppliers are actually increasing the quantity transacted by supplying, whatever they're supplying.
So you're saying he's still taking advantage of the scarcity in the
Yeah,
end.
no,
Yeah,
yeah. I mean, and he's exacerbating it.
right.
So I mean, it's a very special, I would say, an unethical move on his part. Legal profit is not always to the good. It usually
Right.
is.
I mean,
Certainly, the presumption is
he
that it is, but it's not always. Always.
he did claim that for anybody who couldn't afford it, he would donate the
Oh,
medicine, but there's no way to validate that in my mind.
yeah.
Um, I have one last question. I know it's kind of late, and I think both of
Sure.
us kind of have to move on. But this is a issue. There was a tax reform today, not related to this, I think, but the medical devices tax was instituted in 2013, and as last time I checked, it is in effect. Can you explain the effects of this tax on the manufacturer, health providers, and consumers and patients?
Um, Again, I don't know a whole lot about it. I don't think there's that much of a story. I doubt, just from my intuitions, that there's that much of a story here. I mean, there were quite a number of taxes in Obamacare to help pay for it on hospitals, on different things, and one of the things they taxed was medical devices, an ad valorem tax of 2.3%. On stents and hip replacements and pacemakers and what have you. And anybody who gets an additional 2.3%, or maybe it's a little less if there's deductibility for certain corporate taxes and so on. And I think there is. but whatever it is, let's say around 1.5 or 2% effective tax rate on the company, it doesn't help. I mean, it's another wedge in between what the consumer pays and what the seller takes home, and it is going to dampen transactions. It's going to dampen productions. It's going to raise the price to the consumers, and have I assume, the usual effects of taxes. It's not a huge rate, of course, but every little bit hurts in that sense. Of course, it does raise money, and if what the money's being spent on is worthwhile, that helps to redeem it. So I don't know. It's not. Yeah, I'm not in favor of the medical device tax. But I just think it's another tax, and a piece of legislation. It doesn't have. I don't. I saw that there was some claims that the medical device tax destroyed 20,000 jobs in the industry or something. And I think the Washington Post gave the guy 2 Pinocchios on that, because it wasn't plausible that the reduction in the employment in the industry was from the medical device tax. That seemed reasonable, what the Washington Post was saying there. Yeah, how does that sound?
Yeah, I think the what I would say is more plausible than like you said, attributing the job losses directly to the device tax, which there's a lot of variables that go into that. What I do see, what's always the effect of a new tax? The cost of it gets passed on to the consumer. Often it kind of gets rolled in, hidden taxes. They talk a lot about that in Scandinavia, that there's a lot of taxes that don't show up on your, like, directly for the consumer. And the medical devices tax, when when you look at it, the company that develops whatever product it is, whether it's an
Mm-hmm.
ultrasound or a stent, they're not gonna they're not gonna just absorb that cost and say, okay, I guess
Yeah.
we have to pay it. They're gonna mark it up, and that's what's been happening. And therefore,
Mm-hmm.
the healthcare provider has to add that onto their cost. So then they have to, um, it just gets passed on, and the only person who does not get to roll that cost up is the end user, the consumer, the person who gets the stent installed.
Or the
So
insurance
so
company.
yeah, then and the insurance company,
But
they pass. Yeah, go ahead.
we're talking about 2%. I mean, how many fewer stents do you think are sold because let's say the price is 2% higher? I'm just saying it. I don't think it's that huge a deal. I mean, every little bit hurts, but
I think it depends. It really depends, and that would probably take a lot more research. And we're getting to things where we're getting more questions generated than answers. There could be hospitals that, especially ones that are not in the most
yeah.
healthy networks in terms of finances, they're not able to purchase those devices, especially like the top of the line diagnostic equipment. They're not going to be able to purchase it. The more costs you add on, now, like you said, 2%. How much more is that? But the regulatory burden is driving the cost up in my mind, especially for the products that I've been seeing, that I've had experience being a part of working on. So, in my opinion, and this is where I'm going to close. I have to say, when I found your site, I think that this is kind of a topic I want to keep exploring. I hope, maybe one day I can have you back on when there's some more questions, and maybe I have some more findings that I want to run by you. But
Mm-hmm.
I think that this is indeed, people talk about mainly the insurance coverage when they're talking about the healthcare debate, but they don't talk about what they're paying for in terms of quality of care, in terms of the professionals, and in this case, in terms of the devices and pharmaceuticals. So I think, especially, you're monitoring and critiquing the FDA. This is important work, and I hope you keep. Obviously, you're going to keep at it, but I hope you keep adding more details, so that you leave more
Certainty.
breadcrumbs for, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, people really ignore this, and to be honest with you, the media ignores it. They don't really pay any attention to this because it's not exactly headline material. So
your instinct about, gee, costs could just be a lot lower because if there were restrictions lifted, all sorts of options would be opened up. I mean, you see this so much just in medical medical delivery. I mean, look what you and I are doing, right? And there's this whole issue of can't doctors just treat people over the web? Like, think how much that could bring down costs. Um, there's just so much in setting up healthcare services and the licensing of healthcare professionals. That if you lifted those restrictions, licensing of practitioners is a lot like pre-market approval, right? Because it's saying, Joe, you got to prove to us before you can go out and start helping people, and it's the same kind of failures.
Yeah, I have a friend who's a pharmacist who he would have moved out of state a while ago to to pursue like to live with his kids and all that, but the pharmaceutical or the pharmacological association is every state has its own licensing. So his domestic license is invalid any other state that he goes to,
Yeah. Huh.
or beyond in the world. So like you said, like a lot of his he'd be working over the web or whatever.
So he's a
It's not
pharmacist or a doctor?
pharmacist. Yeah.
Yeah. Now ask yourself, do you think that being a qualified, competent pharmacist in Wisconsin doesn't mean that you're going to be able to do it in Texas? I mean, what do you think's going on here, right?
I think, yeah, I think exactly, and I think we were of the same mindset that there's just so many. Uh, I think, what do you call them? Like either niche industries or special interests. That's what I'm talking about on the state level, on the federal level, that they want to keep all of those roadblocks in place because otherwise they wouldn't have what to do with themselves.
Yep.
So that's my opinion. I think based on some of the material I've been seeing on your page, it's a little consistent with it. I think
Mm.
we'll break here, but I want to thank
Sure.
Dr. Daniel Klein, George Mason University. Of course, there's FDAreview.org. Is there another place where you want to talk about where you do your work, or is that about it? Just the
I'm
website
the
and.
I'm the editor of Econ Journal Watch, which is not specific to the FDA. But that's another project of mine. But it's been good talking with you.
All right. Well, thanks for your time, and hopefully we'll be in touch later.
Cool. Thanks a lot.
All right. Have a good night.
Thank you. Bye.